now, and I think we are going to start with the Lempidakis paper, and I believe we've got, now I apologize if I butcher your name, Emmanuel, Manos, I think I've seen floating around, is that correct?
No, no worries at all. It was a very good effort. Yeah, please call me Manos. My official Greek name is Emmanuel, which surprisingly Spanish people can pronounce very, very well.
Great. And we've also, who else we got on here? We've got Emily is on here as well. Hi Emily, how are you?
Hi, very well. Thanks for having us in
Yeah,
the paper.
thanks for joining us, and thanks for sharing your preprint. I think this is a really cool opportunity for us. We've not done this before, so this was quite a cool thing to look at. So David is going to present your paper, and I will hand it over to him now.
Yeah, and Luca Berger is also online.
Oh, Luca is here. Sorry. Hello. I totally missed you. Hello, Luca. How are you?
All right.
Good.
But I don't think that Andrew Ross is with us. But yeah, well, three authors. That's already a luxury. Thanks so much for joining. And I'll give a short introduction to your paper, and then we can chat. And the motto about your paper could be, "Not all cliffs are equal." That's something you put in the manuscript, and I really like the motto. That could be this very short title of your paper. So Manos and Emily and Luca, you're based at Swansea University, and this is a collaboration with Andrew Ross from the University of Leeds. To detail a little more, what you did was to use airflow modeling to predict guillemot breeding habitat on the cliffs of Skomer and Stockholm, two seabird islands of the coast of Wales. And you did this because even though there is abundant literature on seabird breeding habitat selection, hardly any study takes into account the effect of wind. Oh, actually, there's a certain study published by Joanna Berger and Fred Lesser in the IBIS in 1978, which addresses this topic. In this context, it's important to know that wind can affect the risk of eggs or birds being displaced from the nest, as well as exposure to rain and heat stress, for instance, through evaporative heat loss. Wind also has a strong influence on adult flight capacity, and actually there was a previous paper led by Emily Shepard in eLife, I think 2 years ago, which was addressing this topic on under which circumstances the seabirds simply cannot land onto seabird cliffs. So why are there so few studies on wind impacts upon breeding habitat selection? According to the authors, that's due to difficulties in quantifying wind over complex, steep terrain, and that reflects our inability to see airflow characteristics in contrast to rivers, where it is evident from surface movements. This is where computational fluid dynamics comes into play, because they allowed the authors to visualize airflows around sea cliffs, and they are indeed very impressive figures in the paper. In their analysis, they use the magnitude of the wind, the horizontal and vertical wind components, air pressure as a predictor of exposure, gustiness, I like the word gustiness, and turbulence, all of which may affect flight control close to the wind cliffs, to the breeding cliffs. So what did they find? Firstly, winds around Skomer are predominantly from southwest, and most sections occupied by guillemots are oriented away from southwest, which was to be expected. Second, wind, but also slope angle of the cliff predicted colony presence and absence on Skomer. That's probably because steep slopes also offer the possibility of breeding in high densities with better protection from predators, as well as easier access to the sea when guillemot chicks jump from their nest. Yet 90% of the densest colonies on Skomer could be predicted only from a variation in air pressure without the need to consider slope angle. That suggests that colonies are better tuned to wind than to topographical features. Unexpectedly, knowing wind speed did not help predicting colony occurrence. Instead, colonies were associated with lower air pressure and pressure gradients. And finally, the authors did a really nice check, I think, on their model by predicting colony occurrence on Skoma. The model they used on Skoma, they transferred to the island of Stockholm, and there they correctly predicted the distribution of 73% of the largest colonies. So now, beyond this case study, what the authors proposed to do is to apply their approach at larger spatial scales, and the idea is to test the impact of wind patterns affected by climate change on the seabird breeding habitat selection and ultimately fitness. So I'd like to congratulate the authors on a truly innovative study, and it was also extremely well brought up, I think, and written. It made my job very easy at gathering all the facts I needed. And one thing, and that would be my first question, one thing I found surprising, but maybe because I'm naive in this matter, you explained that the wind can be actually blocked by the cliffs, which means that when you're on the cliff, of course, the pressure is high, but not the wind speed. And I wondered whether you could tell us a little more about this, because I had this naive perception that if there was a wind onto a cliff, the wind speed would still be high because the airflow has to escape somewhere. So maybe Manos, you could tell us a little bit more about this.
Yes. First of all, thank you so much for the presentation of our work. It was really nice hearing it from you. Yes, this is actually something that is called orographic blocking. It has been found before. I have seen it in studies in the islands of Hawaii, for instance. As you can imagine, a very steep cliff like those we have on Skoma, as the flow hits the cliff, because it hits the cliff, it creates a high pressure. And at the lower regions of the cliff, the flow is blocked and it is deflected. We have some figures in the supplementary, which I haven't added yet, but some part of the flow will be deflected downwards to the sea and to other sides. Then as you move upwards to the cliff and you reach the hill crests, the flow is again accelerated. At the top of the cliffs, you get what is called flow separation. And then you have...
this is why the cliff top is such a dangerous place, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
For birds and humans alike. And I was wondering, so air pressure seems to be a really important thing. And I was wondering how the birds actually experience this, or if you have any direct sightings of what happens, but with really strong winds when birds in the middle of the cliff experience that air pressure.
Yes, this is very interesting. What comes to mind instantly is it's for a different study and for a different topic, but there have been studies suggesting that seabirds can sense storms coming through to pressure changes. So this is not something that I know, but that Gilly must do. So it is difficult really to quantify how they may sense the pressure changes. I don't know if Emily could add something on this.
We don't, I guess, we don't really know whether it would affect their flight capacity. I mean, I think, the starting point for this study was the eLife study, as you mentioned, which showed that birds have difficulty landing in high winds. But I think one of the interesting things from this follow-on study is that actually flight probably doesn't explain everything, because exposed cliffs, as we say, can have areas where the wind speed is low. So it might be coincidence. It might not be that they're responding to the high pressure. It could just be that high pressures occur in areas that are exposed to substantial wave action in stormy conditions and things as well. So it might be that pressure is correlated with exposure. So it's not a response, it's a response to exposure rather than pressure.
And these pressure gradients, are they in the range where, as humans, we would also feel a difference?
So just to say about that, the pressure we present in this study is not atmospheric pressure. It's something that is called gauge pressure. So it is relative to a fixed value that the simulation start. So the absolute values are not the most important thing, but rather where they are high and where they are low. So atmospheric pressure cannot be negative, but gauge pressure in our simulations can be. But we interpret it as low pressure rather than negative. And this mainly occurs to sheltered cliffs, as we argue. So we can't really say the atmospheric pressure at this level is 1,000 millibars. This is something different.
Okay. I wonder if Grant Marina or the forum have questions. I have another one, but I can keep it on the side for now. If
Why don't we see if Marianne's got a question that she wants to ask?
Yeah. Hello. So yeah, it was a fantastic study. I hope you are planning to extend it to other sites and other species. You already started to actually answer my question, because I was really intrigued by the combination of flight capacity and also the necessity of protection. So finding shelter, especially for the egg. So I was wondering how that. And then you made also in your discussion the example for the albatrosses. They need the strong wind to then lift up, but they also make sort of a nest, let's say, but like it's not really on the cliff like for the guillemots. So I was wondering how you would speculate, let's say, or imagine like the differences for the different species.
Shall I jump in there?
Yeah,
yeah, we're definitely expanding this. So, and it would be really interesting to hear people's thoughts in general or observations about how they've seen their birds in their various systems trying to land and take off, and particularly when they've had trouble, actually. So I think it's what's slightly tricky is that different things might be constraining for different species. So takeoff, we know is likely in the albatrosses, the very large species. They're probably going to need a runway, or they need space to take off. And then, so, well, it's thinking about how that would relate to the constraints of the need to land. So some species that land on cliffs, that means you've got an easy job taking off, because you can basically just drop and then pick up airspeed by losing your altitude. But then you've got to get back into quite a confined space. So I guess it's what will be interesting will be to see which species can manage that, and I think that will already tell us quite a lot. And which species are selecting open areas, and then the combination, the particular airflow characteristics that will predict the distribution of different species, and looking at other things like gannets as well, which I've heard from some people in some areas they can have like runways where they take off, and I haven't been to a gannet colony, so I'd be interested to hear feedback from other people about what you think might be difficult for different systems.
Yeah, actually, now that you mentioned the gannets, when I was reading the paper, so when I was on Fair Isle doing my fieldwork, doing my PhD, for example, the colony of the gannets is doing very well, so well that it's actually starting to colonize actually part of the island, and it made me think about that. I was like, oh, why that part of the island, or why that type? So it started to make me think of all these things, and I was like, whoa, amazing. thing. So yeah, absolutely.
That's super cool.
I think
All right.
Emily has a question.
Yes, she does. Hello, Emily and Michael. It's two people.
Hi. Yeah, it's actually me that has this question. Michael Shrimp, my name isn't listed there, but yeah, I was really interested to see this paper, mostly because this is a lot of the stuff that I wished I'd been able to do when I was working on the Antarctic penguins, which I note that you referenced in the introduction for my dissertation work. And in that, obviously, you know, I was looking at 4 species, 3 of which are penguins and are flightless, and so they didn't have that flight sort of dynamic to worry about. But I you know, what we talk about in our paper is really the conditions at the coastline where the penguins are transitioning from water to land. And so I was wondering if this really fine scale method could be used to say anything about what the shoreline might be like. I know for the alcids that are coming and going via flight, it might not be as important, but maybe it has something to do with the sea conditions where they're rafting near the colony or something like that. I was wondering if you could really extend that wind analysis to what's happening at the coastline.
In terms of waves and wave feds, what we know, what we do know is that partly wind affects exposure to other factors, to waves as well, and wind chill. So that will be connected with temperature. Then we do know that in the case of guillemots, for the chicks, it is important to have easy access to sea when they jump. Surely the topography is what influences wind so much. But as we argue in the paper, aspect alone, we have previously looked at that in other studies, is not the best proxy, because you may have cliffs with same aspect in very different parts of the island, and the surrounding cliffs affect these specific cliffs as well, the flow before them. I'm sure that there's more that can be said there for sure in the future.
But, so were you asking whether the CFD model could predict wind away from the cliffs and therefore tell you something about likely swell height and local variation in swell height? Or
Maybe. I guess I was just wondering more about whether or not the dynamics of the wind right at the cliff could, you know, the downdrafts or the updrafts could impact how waves coming off the ocean are impacting the coastline, and how much exposure there is there.
yeah, it's an interaction we haven't really looked at, that kind of the air-sea interface in modelling that. Yeah, it's an interesting point. It's not something I know about, I'm afraid.
And maybe then previous models which were used rather for water flows, as you mentioned in the introduction, would be already available to detail small scale currents, because that's probably what will affect the penguins most when they get to the shoreline. So maybe it's a slightly different type of modeling.
Yeah, that's really cool stuff, and I wish I would have been able to go into that much detail for my dissertation. Cool paper.
Yeah, we enjoyed reading yours as well. It was very timely. I thought both of them coming around at the same time.
Something for you to do in your spare time, Michael. Thanks for that question. If we have any other questions from the audience, please feel free to just.
Yeah, Luca is.
Oh, is Luca? Oh, Luca. Hello, Luca.
Hello. Just wanted to add to Michael that if you want, engineers and others develop wave models. For example, engineers in our faculty do the modeling of waves and how waves can differ depending on the type of coastline, and they have they have long wave labs where they simulate how the waves develop. So yes, you could certainly do something like this and see how the local conditions affect also potentially if the penguins can access under certain conditions more easily in one shoreline or another.
Thank you, Luca. Okay, if anyone does have any questions, please feel free to put your hand up while we're continuing your discussion. So I had just a quick question, I guess, about the practical applications of this, say for conservation. You know, is this a method that you could use to apply to predict where the best place would be to reintroduce a species?
We do hope that, as we mentioned in the paper, I hope that this could assist current efforts. So people have been using decoys and acoustic attraction and mirrors to attract birds to unoccupied cliffs. I think we're hoping that we could assist where to direct these efforts, which cliffs to select and which to avoid.
Mm-hmm. And then, oh, sorry, Emily, you look like you're going to say something.
I was just going to add, I guess the difficulty comes in knowing what absence means. So, you know, our models, we can predict presence, and then absence, and there'll be areas which are bad and areas which are potentially occupiable, but, you know, have been lost because, you know, of introduced predators or whatever. So I think, yeah, that I guess it just means that that's where the difficulty will lie. But we do need, because of that, you do need models to at least predict presence really well.
Yeah, because you can have all sorts of historical factors driving the distributions and things you cannot observe at this moment in time, but which were transmitted through cultural effects and all the things, you know, people have been looking at previously when they looked at breeding habitat selection.
So I have another question, which is around extreme climate events. So is there any indication that the distribution of the air pressures around these islands might shift with more extreme events, storms and that sort of stuff? And would that have any impact on where these colonies could or could not occur in the future?
Go on.
Well, one thing from our previous study is that we looked, if you run a simulation with the same wind direction, but then increase the speed, then the patterns around the island in the model are generally the same. So one of the things really to come out from this study is actually, you know, there's a lot of consideration about changes in wind speed, because obviously that impacts a lot of different aspects of birds' behavior and ecology. But something that comes out from this is actually that you can, even with no change in speed, but a change in wind direction, then what was once a favorable site can become an unfavorable site. So it's true that, so in some senses, if you're a bird and you're deciding, you're trying to like, weigh up where to breed, then really the scenario is relatively straightforward. If the wind is coming from the same direction, whether, you know, if you've got a really consistent prevailing wind and the storms come from the same direction. But I think actually one of the most damaging scenarios that you could imagine is if a storm comes from a different direction. So it really is the direction which we're highlighting it as something which is important for nesting selection and maybe more important in some senses than strength, or at least as important.
Is it the shape of the topography that defines the air pressure, or is there something else at play?
It is the interaction of the wind with the topography, with the cliff.
Yeah.
So as I was mentioned earlier, the orographic blocking, the blocking we see at the windward cliffs depends on is affected by the height and the slope of the cliff, but all this is caused by the wind and how it interacts with the topography. So it's a combination of both.
Great. Do we have any other questions from the audience? I don't see any hands. So David, do you have any other questions?
Well, I had an additional one, but that was exactly what Mariana addressed. I was wondering, you know, about the applicability of a model to completely different context. And of course, it varies a lot across species. If you're an albatross, again, a cormorant, a cavity nester, or a tree nester, this all has implications because, for instance, and I don't know if it's in this paper that you mentioned this, frigate birds will on purpose try to use trees which are exposed to the wind. I read so. So I guess it varies a lot according to context. That was also my thought about it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you think for those of you who've spent any time at sooty, like shearwater colonies, especially the forested ones and around New Zealand, when the birds come in at nighttime, I mean, there's not much in cliffs where they're breeding, but when they come in, they fly over the forest and they just kind of drop out of the sky. It's kind of like it's raining shearwaters in the colony. But then you look at, say, albatross, and you get albatross colonies. One of the ones that sticks out in my mind is West Point Island in the Falklands, the black-browed albatross there. When they come to the colony, I mean, they really rely on those cliffs to get that lift to get back into to their nesting sites. Certainly when you watch them land, you can see how they're very, very strongly dependent on the updrafts coming off the cliffs to be able to navigate to their nests. So I think it'll be very interesting to see this applied to other species. Really keen to see that coming forward. So thank you very much. If we don't have any other questions, I think we can kind of use that as a segue into our next paper about albatross. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Manos. Thank you, Luca. A very, very cool paper. And thank you for sharing the preprint with us. I realize that's not something that's typically done. So that was really fascinating. Thanks. So the next paper we've got is a wind and albatross paper. We've got Caitlin Kroeger with us. And who else do we have from your paper on with us today? Caitlin? I'm not sure.
I think Lee is here, Lee Torres.
Oh, is she? Lee, you're welcome to unmute yourself at any point. If you have anything to add or want to join us on camera, please do. In the meantime, I think we will hand it over to Mariana. Please.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, Caitlin. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Really, it was really a pleasure to read this paper. I've learned a lot. I am absolutely not an expert in albatrosses or wind, so thank you. So you just changed the position. You are now a postdoc, or
Yeah.
did I misunderstand? Because okay.
Yeah, I'm at the Fairlawn Institute.
So this is so this was a part of your PhD.
Yeah, at University
Cool.
of California, Santa Cruz. Yep.
Cool. So Caitlin, in her paper, she talks about how animals, and so albatrosses, adjust their behavior to maintain homeostasis when energy costs become too great, such, for example, when we have extreme weather events or extreme environmental condition in general. So what the authors explain is that when behavioral changes are energetically maladaptive, long-lived animals like seabirds and so albatrosses may favor self-maintenance over breeding, as this is basically predicted by life history theory. Environmental factors can affect the energy balance of animals, and intrinsic variabilities, for example, the status of an individual, so if it is breeding or not, or the sex, can also have an impact on the energy balance. So, this problem is also most important when the individuals have to maintain energy balances in a changing world, and so it's important for seabirds during the breeding season. So, in this study, the authors measure the at sea daily energy expenditure of these two species of albatrosses. We have the Campbell and the gray-headed albatrosses, which have two different foraging strategies and life history also strategies. So The objective was to measure energetic cost of foraging across species, sex, and years, and to identify important behavioral environmental factors that influence the variation in the daily energetic expenditure. So it was hypothesized that the gray-headed albatross, which breeds every second year, will have a higher the daily energy expenditure, as the breeding cost basically is supposed to be high, and so that's the reason why then they breed in this way. And the differences in the daily energy expenditure between year or sexes for both species are also driven by the environment. And here the authors took in consideration wind speed and the sea surface temperature. So unexpectedly, the daily energy expenditure was similar across the two species, and so the authors start a series of like in the discussion started to explain why this was so. So. We have a lot to talk about in this paper. So you found, for example, that the gray-headed albatross is very good in maneuvering in strong winds, and this is basically so it uses basically strong winds, which is basically also saying that. It's gaining a lot of mass, it's becoming heavier, so it should basically use more energy, but by using basically the strong wind, it is actually aiding itself in maneuvering while flying. So I was wondering if you can expand this a little bit and also include the other species of the that you worked on.
Sure, yeah. So we kind of expected, because the gray-headed albatross are delaying their breeding, as you said, that they might have incurred some more costs during the breeding stage, a detriment to their self-maintenance, maybe they're expending more energy. And so yeah, the gray-headed albatrosses are using these high wind regions, and actually also so are the male Campbell albatrosses, which are a little bit bigger than the females. And so they're going to these strong wind areas, and where you have more wind, you have more lift at takeoff, which was one of the other things we found was a predictor of differences in energy expenditure. So the birds that had greater wind at takeoff, if you have a heavier food load, you can bring more food to your chick, and you can carry that mass at a lower energetic cost to yourself. So that's one of the reasons we think that the gray-headed albatross maybe have lower daily energy expenditure than we had expected to find. They can carry these big food loads to their chick and potentially offset that cost.
But so then, so given that they showed a similar daily energy expenditure, and so correct me if I am wrong. So both species are good in maneuvering across the different wind conditions. Then you then started to discuss the differences in their foraging strategies. So you say that it's indeed, it might be. That is the diet of the gray-headed albatross that might actually be one of the reasons why then the breeding is skipped.
Yeah, they're eating different food sources. The Campbell albatrosses are focusing more on fish in their diet, where the gray-headed albatross are focusing primarily on squid. And then there's new studies showing that the birds are eating jellyfish and salps and things that we didn't really expect. So kind of hard to say what the balance of the different diet is. But yeah, if the gray-headed albatrosses are carrying more food to their chicks, but that have, lower energetic value, then they're also, I think part of this I want to say is that they're going a longer distance to get this food that's potentially a lower energetic value. and then they're taking it to their chick. And so there is potentially a cost to the gray-headed albatross themselves in that they're not getting that chance to restore their own energy reserves. Whereas the camel albatrosses are taking these short trips, they're potentially getting more energetic value food, and they can come back really fast. Generally, they came back a bit faster than the grayheads. Some birds were gone for a day and came back, where the grayheads could be gone up to 5 days. Some birds were gone longer than that, and we actually couldn't really get samples from them because the isotope had actually washed out. And so if they're going this long distance, getting this food and bringing it back to the chick, it's possible that the diet could explain that. And it's also possible that different breeding stages could explain the cost of the gray-headed albatross. But yeah, that's definitely a factor.
I was wondering if there are any studies, maybe not, but maybe, I mean, you know more than me for sure, that have also looked at what happens after the breeding season. So in this year gap and any environmental conditions or anything that is know about that, it might also affect this skipping.
Yeah, I'm not sure if there are any studies on these species that look at the overwintering impacts. And that's a hard one to also quantify energetically because they're not on the island and gone for long periods of time. I don't know if Lee knows of any, but I'm not aware.
I really found very very fascinating, like how you discuss like the difference between the two species and how they use different wind, like the wind strength, so the different wind condition. So it seems like the Campbell albatross instead likes to sit and wait.
Yeah, they're definitely thriving a bit better in the lower wind conditions, which is really cool, especially the females that tend to go farther north in lower wind areas. Yeah.
And I was yeah, no, keep going.
Oh, I was just going to say, which I think has interesting implications for the differences and how changes in wind patterns in the next century could affect the sexes differently. Because the females and male Campbell albatrosses are using such different areas, which is pretty cool.
But also like how so there are so many nuances in how they actually are maneuvering in these wind conditions. So at some point I started to think like we really need like an onboard, a tag onboard that is recording the energetic expenditure, the wind conditions and acceleration or anything really to have the real the real time sort of maneuvering to really capture all these nuances that you were discussing.
Yeah, I think I wish I had accelerometer data to use. I didn't, unfortunately, but yeah, in hindsight, all of the things would have been great to use all at once. And what would have been really cool is to actually know their height, their exact height with some sort of barometric pressure reading. It's so complex, and they're moving, they're tacking a lot, and so the way the wind is calculated on the bird is really just sort of an average of their total direction in space, right? Because they're constantly turning angles, so it's a tricky one.
Yeah. I was wondering if the wind variable that you used was a good resolution for the movement of the individuals, or if I mean, I know that like higher resolution is always better, but if you found it appropriate or you complained a bit.
Yeah, I mean, it was the best we could do, right? So.
Of course.
I think that for the purposes of the study that we did, it was a decent resolution,
okay.
Obviously. more higher resolution is always better, but which
Of course.
which is why you
Yeah,
would want,
like we said.
yeah, it would be great if you could measure all of that stuff directly on the animal, but
Yeah, this is
I think
exactly. This
technology
is
has
like the
it.
question I give you. Exactly. I give you like $1 million of euros. What would you do? Everything. Yes, of course, of course. But yeah, it was very, very interesting. And yeah, if David and Grant or the audience has some more questions.
Yeah, well, I was about to ask the now classic question about accelerometers, and also to apologize for asking this question probably. But Mariana asked also, so we dealt with that fortunately. No, I was wondering whether the whole work had been performed also in a conservation context, which I know is a big thing in New Zealand. Also with respect to access to these study sites. I was sort of surprised to see such a fundamental project. So I was wondering whether, the whole tracking and also the doubly labeled water, whether there was a set applied context from the beginning, or whether it was done out of the blue.
There was a lot of different studies sort of happening in one. And so a large part of the project I was working on was to collect tracking data that would be used to look at overlap with fisheries, which was not part of this study, but we sort of did this tangential to that. If we're gonna, collect tracks, let's also see how these birds are being energetically impacted by their environment as well. So my study was not with an explicit conservation focus in mind, but I think that it does have implications for the birds. Obviously, it's a very complex thing, right? Because as winds are changing, it affects their energy expenditure, but it's also affecting productivity in the ocean, where some areas are going to have lower mixed layer depths and food productivity is going to go down. Some areas are going to have more upwelling because of strengthening winds. So there's all kinds of things that we didn't look at that we could have, but well,
yeah, and so the energetics part. I'm sorry if I missed some key papers, but the energetics part, was it also thought with respect to potential interactions with fisheries, and I don't know, to try and assess how much resources the birds were needing of these sort of things?
We have not done that yet. No, we haven't looked at that, but certainly you could calculate the amount of food required for these birds. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So that's good. I didn't miss a key paper. I was worried I had done that. Yeah. No, that sounds like one possibility, and of course the beauty of doubly labeled water is that you get a fairly accurate measurement, except that it drives you nuts to try and recatch the birds on time.
Yeah.
But yeah, as we said previously, with accelerometers, you probably would have a better breakdown of what is happening at sea. But yeah, I totally understand the constraints linked to when you gather the data.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's always in hindsight the things you wish you had, and the things you wish you had money to do.
Yeah.
We had unlimited funds, right? Has there been any work done looking at whether or not this has population level effects? I mean, has that been looked at in any way yet?
We were not on. Well, so surveys are done to see what the population looks like, but I think that would be to see how the energy expenditure is changing and impacts of wind changes on the population. I think that would be a much longer term study, but a easier way to do that would be to look at something like fledgling success, but we just weren't on the island for long enough to measure those population level metrics, unfortunately.
Are those data collected at all? But is anybody doing that kind of monitoring down there year on year?
No, there's nobody there. So we
bad.
And the albatrosses have such a long breeding season that it just wasn't feasible to stay for the whole thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Unless you want to just live on an albatross colony.
Right.
There's nothing wrong with that either, right?
Joanna has a question.
Oh,
Yeah,
Joe.
yeah. Hi, everybody. I wondered whether anybody's thought about how climate change and sea temperature changes are going to affect these kind of dynamics with respect to these issues, because it seems to me it's conceivably a problem for some sites.
Yeah, do you mean with respect to their food sources or
Yeah, just
that-
their ability to live within that environment with changes that are occurring.
Yeah, I do. I actually wonder, I think more about just from being on the island with the birds and watching them on hot days, like that is more of a concern to me, actually, how it will impact them at the breeding site. Because on those warm days, these birds are really adapted for cold. And so you see them trying to incubate their chicks and they're panting and generally looking a little bit distressed. But the sea surface temperature, I'm sure it's going to have impacts on the productivity and probably, I mean, I know that on Campbell Island, I think there was a study that suggested that one of the penguin populations was declined because sea surface temperatures moving those food sources farther away from the island, which is not quite as much of a problem for penguin or for albatross because they can soar quite a distance, but for birds like penguins, certainly an issue.
Has there been any work done on, say, analog species that might suggest that these birds are relatively flexible or plastic and they can adapt to changes much more easily than other species?
I'm sure there's a lot. I feel like there's a lot of work that shows how adaptable the birds are. I mean, the study on the wandering albatross showing that they're actually thriving with greater wind conditions. I'm not sure if that's what you're referring to, but yeah, they're doing great because they're a huge bird, and strengthening winds, towards the pole is helping them get to their foraging grounds faster, and it's helping them able to carry more food because they're getting all that lift. And so I think what's interesting about that is that it's not necessarily linear, especially for smaller birds. Things like wind, it's so complex. It's hard to know as it increases, like what's the tipping point? When does it become too energetically expensive? Especially this paper showing that those really strong winds do increase their energy expenditure. So I think the smaller albatrosses will struggle more, and I think birds that are not so adapted to the wind, albatrosses are great in the wind. So it does have implications for other species. So I'm not sure if that answered your question.
That's fantastic. David, Mariana, do you have some more questions for Caitlin or any from the audience? No. I've got a question that was just messaged to me from who's messaged me. Stephanie Schneider has messaged me. She actually accidentally sent me a direct message, so I will post it in the everybody chat. The chat that you see, the question that you see down here in the chat right now is from Stephanie. She has a simple question. Just curious if there were wind speeds at which these birds don't fly or avoid flying.
Yeah, I think when there's no wind, they're not flying. They're sitting on the water, and that's what we saw with the Campbell albatrosses. They're spending a lot more time on the water in low winds, less than 5 meters per second. But the high winds, I don't think that stops them, but I think it makes it more of a struggle.
I don't know if there's been any work on showing how they might manage flying through, say, hurricane force winds. I reckon they probably do fine in that sort of stuff. But I mean,
yeah, I think they
is there an upper
faster.
limit? Where do they just get to a point where they just get blown away?
Yeah, there is a study showing a bird in a storm, an albatross, a gray-headed albatross in a storm by Catry, and they just go really fast. So
take it.
And as you said, at wind speed below 5 meters per second, so they stay on the water. Does it mean that they technically cannot take off, or whether the cost is high and so they prefer to have this wait and see strategy?
I think they're just deciding to wait and see, because I imagine they can run on the water, and I've seen these birds, like, they can flap pretty good. They can get up there if they really need to, if there's a reason. I imagine if there was a shark coming up underneath them, they would go. But yeah, they will sit there, and this would be another reason to have accelerometers, because they're paddling around and looking for food when they're on the water. And so if they're getting food, and especially if they're digesting food, if they've landed and the wind is really low, I think they're just going to sit for longer.
Yeah, and the heart rate measurements also showed that taking off was the big effort.
Yeah,
much more than anything else if the wind was low.
Exactly.
An interesting for some reason or another, reminded me of a scene from Muppet Treasure Island where the ship is dead in the water and they all start singing Cabin Fever.
I don't think I've seen that one.
If you're
I did want to say, in relation to the paper that we discussed before, that was really amazing. And it made me think of being in the Campbell Albatross colony, where there was one part of the colony that was farther back on the top of the cliff, sort of like a little nook. And those birds really struggled to land. And a lot of them on low wind days, their strategy was sort of to plow into the bushes and drop into the colony. So
I think when I was on West Point a few years ago, I took a 360 camera with me and set it up in the colony and walked away. And I've got these videos of these albatross coming in and doing these circular flights as if they're in a traffic pattern and missing every time they come in, just like you would.
Oh yeah. I would wait for birds I saw that they had my tag on them, and it was torture watching them try to land over and over. They'd certainly take their time with it.
Surely albatrosses won't do. There was this video, I can't remember if it was a razorbill or a guillemot landing, and then they kept bouncing on the. I mean, that is so typical of guillemots or razorbills. I can't remember which one of the two it was. So I was really thinking, say, these albatrosses, they're not like so bad and bouncing around.
They're better when the wind is higher. They're very graceful landing on their nest. But yeah, those birds at the top of the cliff, that on low wind days were covered, they would just plop right in and be covered in mud. Yeah,
makes it exciting to watch. All right, I think we are out of time, and it has been fantastic having you, Caitlin. And say hi to your Farallon Institute.
I will.
I miss them all very, very much.
Will.
Give Bill a high five for me. I have fond memories of my time at the Farallon Institute.
I will let him know.
And yes, thank you for joining us. Thank you for such a great paper. Thank you to Manos and Emily and Luca for your paper as well. David and Mariana. It's hardly necessary to say thank you at this point.
Thank you.
But yes, we're looking forward to seeing you all next time. And remember, for those of you who are interested in coming to our open mic night, please sign up and come along and try out that platform. It's going to be fantastic. And again, don't forget about World Seabird Twitter conference coming up. Keep your eyes to Twitter for that. It is going to be spectacular. Lots of cool prizes and some great talks. So with that, I hope you all have a fantastic evening or afternoon or morning, wherever it is in the world you are. And we will see you next time. And with that, I will